Introducing Punchbowl News. From Anna Palmer, Jake Sherman, and John Bresnahan. News about the people who matter, for the people who matter. Join the community at punchbowl.news.
Well, good Tuesday morning. I'm Anna Palmer, a founder and CEO of Punchbowl News. Thank you so much for joining us for this pop-up virtual event with Montana Democratic Senator Jon Tester to talk about news of the day and the future of rural communities as Congress focuses on broadband infrastructure, climate initiatives, and other programs that will impact rural communities. I want to say a big thank you to the One Country Project for making the conversation possible. And after our conversation with Senator Tester, we will be joined by One Country Project founder and former North Dakota Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp for a fireside chat. And just a reminder for everyone watching today, you can follow us on all social media platforms at Punchbowl News. I'm at A Palmer DC as well. And now I'd like to welcome Senator Jon Tester to join me.
With you, Anna, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it. Before we get to the main topic of the day, the future of rural communities, and something that I know you are very passionate about coming from the state of Montana, I want to just kind of center the conversation a little bit in the dialogue that's happening in Washington right now, particularly over the Build Back Better Act. The House is expected to take up that legislation later this week. I know you've been pretty optimistic about it passing before the end of the year. I wanted to get your take today. Do you really think it's going to be able to get done before the end of the year? And how important is it for Democrats that this does happen sooner rather than later?
Well, first of all, I want to go back and tell you how we got the BIF done. We got the BIF done because we had people that wanted to get to yes. And we did. We rolled up our sleeves and we all worked together and we all got to yes. Took a lot of arguing and yowling, but we got there. And I think it's the same thing with the Build Back Better piece. I think you've got to want people to be able to get to yes. That means they have to want to negotiate and aren't locked into idealistic positions. And I think if we're in a position where people are looking not how much money is spent, but rather how this money is spent and the results from that money, then I think we can get it done before the first of the year. But it's going to take a lot of work. There's no doubt about that. And then also how it's paid for is going to be really important too, both to the White House and to folks in Congress. And so there's a lot of work to do, Anna. But no, I think that if folks really want to get this done, it's possible to get it done by the end of the year. But it's going to take folks that are willing to negotiate and not be dug in.
You said a lot of yowling to get it done. There's a lot of focus on the yowling or the consternation that certain senators, such as Senator Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, or Kyrsten Sinema, the Democrat from Arizona, and how they kind of held up these negotiations and whether they're actually negotiating in good faith. Can you talk about the mood in the Senate Democratic caucus? Do you think that they're negotiating good faith? Do you think that they want to get to yes?
I do. I do think they want to get to yes. I think everybody represents different states, and everybody's going to have a little different take on this stuff. I think that what's really critically important to get to the bottom line of the Build Back Better is make sure that we know everybody's proof point, where they want to be in the end, and then I think we can negotiate. And look, I feel very strongly about certain issues in the Build Back Better program. But I also know that through the legislative process, you never get everything you want. And hopefully everybody realizes that you have to negotiate. And I do think, look, what Joe is doing, what Kristen's doing, what I'm doing, what Jean Shaheen's doing, a number of folks in there, all 50 of us, we're looking at it from our perspective. And that's the challenge with legislation. You have to hear everybody out, you have to debate, and then you have to come to an agreement. And I think that what's gone on so far is pretty typical to how the legislative process works.
It's never easy. All right, let's move on to the topic of the day, the future of rural America. Yesterday, President Joe Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill into law. You were at the White House, I believe. It's going to have a massive impact on rural communities. Can you talk about, I know broadband in particular has been something that you've focused on, that rural communities are really needing. Can you talk about why that's so important to you and what that impact might have?
Well, if you want to talk about broadband for a second, which is part of the bipartisan infrastructure package, What I've been telling the folks in Montana, and I believe this, is that if this money is spent correctly, everybody will have access to good broadband. And I think that is going to be the case. I was happy to hear the president yesterday say that Mitch Landrieu is going to be the point person on this. This makes my life a lot easier because then we do our oversight. We've got one person we can pound on to make sure that this money gets out the door in a timely and responsible way. And in the end, this is going to help both urban and rural areas, but it's really going to help rural areas and areas of broadband because, quite honestly, there's a lot of places in a state like Montana that simply do not have access to the internet, and we don't have good cell service. This is going to help. This is going to help on both of those fronts, and I think the sooner we can get it out and get it distributed, and whether it's for putting fiber in the ground or for low orbital broadband, I think this can be a real winner for rural America. But, Anna, Democrats have to get out and sell it. Democrats have to talk about it. Democrats have to talk about how things have changed because this bill was passed through Congress. And of course, you have to have points through the process where you can say this is changing. Look at the good things that have been done.
Talk about that, because I think there's been some frustration from outside groups, from other people, that Democrats haven't done a very good job of talking about what's actually in this bill. Certainly that's the criticism of the Build Back Better Act, just in terms of, you look at the president's approval ratings, but if you look at individual parts of this, legislation, it seems as though it's actually very popular. Where's the disconnect there? What should the message be that isn't getting delivered right now?
You're going to have Heidi Heidkamp on a little bit, and I don't think she's going to disagree with me. Democrats don't do a good job of selling. We don't do a good job of talking about what we've accomplished. We do stuff, and then we move on to the next project, and we don't talk about it. I think it's going to be really critically important for this and others to say what's in it, because people don't understand what's in it unless you tell them what's in it. I'm in a process right now to talk to folks at local media in Montana about explaining to them what's in this bill and how it can change our way of doing business in Montana for the better and actually lower costs for families and help small businesses expand. And I think once this is done, if we get a good Build Back Better bill that deals with childcare and deals with lowering housing costs and deals with common sense ways to deal with climate change, we can sell that to the American people too, and you can sell it to rural America too. But you have to show up and you have to talk about it.
Another big issue for Montana is the investments in rural water systems. What impact is that going to have? Talk about how you're going to sell that to your own home state to make sure that they know why that's so important.
We're a headwater state in Montana, and I'm going to tell you that this is huge. I think you're going to see economic development in the 21st century flow to places that have water. And without water, economic development is going to be very, very, very difficult. Water infrastructure is instrumental in making sure that you can utilize the water you have. And look, Montana is no different than any other state in the union. Many of these water systems in small towns and large towns alike are wore out. The ones in rural areas don't exist. This bill is going to help do both. It's going to help replace those small and medium-sized water systems in a huge way. And it's going to help a lot of the rural projects get done so people have good water. And then I think you can really talk about economic development in a reasonable way, because without water, economic development just is not possible.
Oftentimes in Washington, there seems to be this kind of disconnect between the coasts and the rural communities. I was just back. I'm originally from North Dakota. I was there. And the feeling when I talk to my relatives and people, from my hometown, is that like DC just doesn't get it, right? They don't get the real world. What do you attribute that disconnect to? And can Democrats win over these skeptics when so much of the party is fixated or focused on the real progressive bent, the AOCs of the world?
Look, I think that 50 years ago where I live, it was primarily a Democratic state. And it was a very much Democratic. We've always had a libertarian bent to everything we've done since the homesteaders. But the bottom line is that Montana was once a Democratic state, a very blue state. And I think moving forward, I think it's pretty simple to get those folks back. And that is you have to talk about what you've accomplished. It has been very popular in my lifetime to run against Washington, D.C. and to say these guys don't know what they're doing. And look, in some cases, they're 100% correct. But in other cases, in many cases, there's a lot of folks back here who want to do right by rural America. We just need to let folks know that, number one, it does cost money to do infrastructure. It just doesn't happen without a concerted effort. And if you come back to Washington, D.C. to get things done, infrastructure, education, research and development, good trade policy, all of those things are democratic values. And all of those things appeal to rural America.
I want you to put on your kind of political hat. You've run the DSCC, been very active in campaigns, close campaigns in your own career. President Joe Biden's poll numbers are pretty terrible right now. I think everybody would agree at that. A lot of Democrats are nervous. How do you think the party could do a better job of, I mean, we've kind of talked about this a lot, that they need to communicate better, but is there a reason why Democrats aren't going on the attack on some of these things? It seems like they maybe are just letting kind of Republicans own a lot of these issues that, you know, when it comes to spending, when it comes to inflation or the economy, instead of kind of punching back.
Well, I think that we could do a better job punching back on some of the stuff that's being said, because quite honestly, some of it isn't true. Some of it is. But remember this, Anna, we're nearly 3 years away from the next presidential election. There's going to be a lot of water that flows under the bridge between now and then. And so I think that what we really need to focus on is events like happened yesterday, where we got the bipartisan infrastructure through the Senate, through the House, and to the president's desk that actually is going to change this country for the better. Largest investment in infrastructure in this country's history in a non-emergency situation. So these kind of things are truly huge. And then, you know, I mean, the Build Back Better is going to come down the line. If we invest this money correctly, so it actually does make childcare more available and reduces costs, if it actually does help workforce housing come into effect so people can afford to buy a house, if it actually does put money into R&D for affordable battery technology and new generation opportunities and distribution, man, I'll tell you what, give me those issues. I'll campaign all over the country, but it'll particularly sell in rural America. But you got to show up. You got to show up and you got to talk about what you're doing. And look, Joe Biden's been in politics for a long time. He understands that. And I think over the next 3 years, we have to get things done, and it has to be done in a reasonable way. And we have to be fiscally responsible along the way. But ultimately, there's plenty of opportunity out there for Democrats to succeed, both in 2022 and 2024.
How much of a distraction? I mean, you talk about that's a lot of things that Democrats could be campaigning on, but one of the biggest issues in the most recent Virginia, New Jersey, and some of the state and local elections was a lot of things on the ballot around defunding the police. Is that a distraction? Is that something that just kind of eliminates potentially, you know, possible Democrats or independents in your state from wanting to support Democratic candidates?
This is a prime example of an issue that Democrats have been pegged with, maybe because one or two folks said it, that is totally unrealistic. And by the way, I don't know anybody in the United States Senate, Democrat in the United States Senate, that wants to defund the police. And if they do, they're wrong on that policy. Bottom line is, we need police. It's a very difficult job, and we need to make sure that they're out there and able to do their job as best they can. In fact, I will tell you, and this is something that Heidi Heitkamp knows about too, in Indian country, we need far more police. We don't need to defund them. We need to get more folks out there on the ground because of poverty. Crime is very high in those areas. So look, the defund the police stuff is garbage. I'll just put it that way, and I'm being generous. The fact of the matter is, folks don't want to defund the police. This is a red herring that's put up to try to put Democrats in a difficult situation. There is no truth to it.
Time, but I have two more questions for you. I want to ask about inflation. We touched on it a little bit. It's clearly becoming a bigger issue. Americans are feeling it in their own homes, in their own pocketbooks. When you look at the price of gas and other issues, how do you see that impacting rural communities' attitudes towards Democrats? Do you think this is going to be one of the underlying issues going into next year?
So it's a two-edged sword. Look, price of energy has gone up. There's no doubt about that. It's undeniable. The price of grain has gone up, and gone up significantly, by the way, which is a very, very good thing if you're in production agriculture. But the truth is the inflation issue we have to get our arms around. It's one of the reasons that I have advocated strongly to reappoint Chairman Powell to the Fed and get him confirmed, because I think there's opportunities within the financial system to do some things with inflation. I will also tell you the passing of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I think the Moody has said this is going to reduce inflation because businesses are going to cost them less to do business. Those savings will be passed on to consumers. So look, there's a lot of things out there, and I will tell you that inflation right now is a big concern, not only for me as a U.S. senator, but also for me as a farmer, as somebody in production agriculture. And so we've definitely concerns, but there's things we can do about this moving forward, and things that will work too.
I want to ask you one quick question, because you mentioned Chairman Powell. We expect to have an announcement today on that. Would you support anybody else but him, or are you really firmly in the case that you want Powell to be his term to be extended?
I am a big Jerome Powell fan. I think he has done a great job, and I will tell you that I don't think you could find anybody better to do the job than Chairman Powell. He's been straight up with me. He's told me good news. He's told me bad news. He's been responsive. And I think he's done a great job as chairman of the Fed. And I think it would be the right move to reappoint him.
All right. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you one last politics question. The Senate is 50-50, the longest it's been 50-50 in decades. We have a kind of untested Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in this role for the first time. Can you give a grade of how you think Schumer's doing? And then also, do you think that Democrats will have the majority after 2022 in the Senate?
I'll answer your last question first. If we do our work, we'll absolutely have a majority after 2022. There's a lot of opportunities out there on the political landscape. As far as a 50-50 Senate, I will tell you Chuck Schumer has got a very difficult job, a job I wouldn't want. And I think Chuck has done masterfully on it. So far, so good. But the next 6 weeks are really going to be a test for him as majority leader. And bringing people together is not easy in the Democratic caucus. It's very similar to herding cats. But Chuck's got to be the main herder and get that job done.
All right. Well, Senator Tester, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you, Anna. Thank you.
All right. And now we are going to bring on former Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota and founder of the One Country Project. Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks for that great interview. One of my favorite people in the whole wide world is Jon Tester. We're not only former colleagues, but we're buddies. And if anyone thinks you can underestimate Jon Tester, you don't really know him very well, let me tell you.
There you go. A strong endorsement for Senator Tester, and not unsurprisingly. Let's talk a little bit about One Country Project as part of this fireside conversation. I know that you have some slides that can kind of run through some of the work that you've been doing, but maybe from a 30,000 foot for our viewers who aren't familiar with the group, can you give us what you all are up to?
It's interesting because I think in the beginning, people thought that Donald Trump really began that slide in rural America. That's not true. It began long before Donald Trump. And actually, I would put it with the Tea Party. We started losing elections. We started losing great senators, people like Tom Daschle. You saw Kenton Byron, both from North Dakota, retire. You saw Tim Johnson retire. That was all before Donald Trump. And so, this is not something that we can pin just to one man or one movement. This has been happening for a long time. And what's tragic about that is I've always believed that the Democratic policies are the best policies for rural America. If you don't believe me, look at the infrastructure bill that was just passed. Look at the kinds of farm bills that the Democrats have promoted over a long period of time. Look at rural broadband now, and in the past, rural infrastructure in the form of electricity. And so we have a rich history of helping and believing in rural America, but yet rural America does not see the Democratic Party as 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 an entity that represents their values. And so I started One Country after the 18 election, just because I don't think, number one, we can be a majority party in any kind of consistent way unless we start winning back some rural votes. Plus, I don't think we can be a united country unless we see rural America being much more politically diverse. And so I always say One Country was started to reintroduce the Democratic Party to rural America and rural America to the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party values. And so it's been a labor of love, and it's a struggle. I won't deny that, but it is something that I care deeply about, which is making sure that rural America is adequately represented.
Well, talk about that a little bit. So you recently had a summit. I know you've been doing a lot of polling around this disconnect around, kind of the values and the issues that are important to rural American voters, as well as kind of where they stand between the Republicans and the Democrats. Can you, kind of detail that a little bit for us?
Well, we started doing some polling early on in this cycle, recognizing that we saw the situation not getting better, but actually getting worse. And we asked some pretty pointed questions, and I don't know if we can bring up a couple of the slides from the poll that we just did. But the first one, I think, really illustrates some interesting kind of analysis, which is, I'm trying to get this bigger. So it says, do you think that Build Back Better will help rural America? Of course, people think that it's going to help rural America. If we can go to this slide that shows that we've got, where voter attitudes are about perspectives or perceptions of Democrats versus Republicans. This is Joe Biden's approval rating. But if we can go back to the first one, I think that's the one that I really would like to illustrate, which is when you ask people if they believe in that the Democratic Party represents their values, and that they understand the Democratic Party, what you're going to find is about 57% say Democratic Party doesn't have a clue about what goes on in rural America. That's bad news for the Democratic Party. Guess what the numbers are for the Republican Party? They're 50%. And so I think and Anna, you know this because you grew up in rural America. We always feel like people don't get us. We always feel like people don't understand what the challenges are. And I think when you introduced Senator Tester, you said, just been home. People say, boy, in Washington, they don't get it. That's because way too often we don't make sure that they get it. We don't make sure that they understand what's being done. I think Senator Tester made the case just so openly about how we need to get out there, how we need to talk about how this is going to help, how Build Back Better could help if we could lower the cost of daycare, if we could bring some additional resources for rural housing. Rural water is a huge issue, rural infrastructure. We talk about roads and bridges and farm to market roads. But, I think you look at some of the rural water systems that were put in our part of the world, Anna, they're aging out and rural communities can't afford to replace them. This will be a huge influx of dollars for rural water infrastructure. Yay. I mean, it's not just about broadband. I get a little testy when people say, oh, the Democratic Party is going to, bring broadband. Well, okay, that's important, and I don't deny it. But in North Dakota, we have pretty good broadband in rural America because of Byron Dorgan. Right. And it's not the whole key. The whole key is how do we create communities that people want to live in, and how do we create opportunities for people to live in rural communities that go beyond agriculture, that go beyond light manufacturing, that create that opportunity to work from home. Anna, we'd love you to move back to Kindred and do your show from Kindred. I mean, it's becoming more and more possible with the right resources. But the Democratic Party needs to not only address what people need in rural America, but also represent the values. And when you talked about, Anna, the defund the police, no one really thinks that's going to happen. Number one, federal government doesn't have much to do with all of that. You saw what happened in the vote in Minnesota, even in a very blue part of the country, which is Hennepin County, it failed. So this isn't a reality, but it's reflective of what people think are values. And we need to be clear about what those values are. We need to do things like John Tester just did and call malarkey. If I can use Biden's word, I think Tester's word might have been a little tougher if he hadn't been being taped. But it's crap. That we want to defund the police, but yet it sends a message that we don't share people's values.
So talk quickly. I want to ask you a couple more questions before we get to the end of our time here. And first being, because I know you spent a lot of time at One Country Project thinking about this. You've run in North Dakota, you've run statewide and won, which is very difficult. But like, what is, if you had one message for Democrats about them going into the 2022 midterms, what should they be communicating to rural America that they aren't right now?
Well, they got to show up. I mean, they can't run away from it. One of the things that I always say, and everybody's favorite punching bag these days in the progressive side is my friend Joe Manchin. But everybody forgets he did Manchin to me, which was a really big deal in a state like West Virginia that reveres the Second Amendment, not unlike North Dakota. And he was getting tons of heat. Guess what he did? He went to every VFW hall in West Virginia. He showed up. He took the questions. He took the heat and explained why he did what he did, talked about visiting with the Sandy Hook parents and how something needed to be done, and really spoke from his heart. You've got to have the courage to do that. And we've gotten lazy in the Democratic Party. And I look forward to what I think is going to happen in Texas, a state to watch, with both Matthew Dodd and now Beto O'Rourke running. I think they are not going to ignore any part of Texas. I think they're going to set the standard for what it's going to look like to actually show up in every part of Texas. And I think the Republicans should be very concerned about that duo, because they get it and they get the importance of showing up. And to me, it's really hard not to like people if you're standing next to them. That's one thing I've learned in politics. When people were really mad at me, the most important thing you can do is go to visit them.
Talk about inflation. We were speaking about it before the program started, and that is clearly going to be a big issue that it seems as though the Biden administration, and I think even some Democrats, really discounted as it being, as big of an issue, and that it's going to continue to be an issue in 2022. How do you think Democrats should be positioning themselves on that issue going forward?
I think the biggest mistake the Democrats made initially was denying that it was a problem, thinking that it was a short term, this is all going to break in the next couple months. I wrote an op-ed for CNBC basically saying, hey, pay attention. This is real. And I think yes, we've had supply side disruptions because of COVID, but don't just put it on COVID. We're reaping the results of Donald Trump's trade policy, tariffs that increase costs for consumers. We talked about when Donald Trump said, all of that's going to pay for itself. And we said, no, it's not. The consumers are going to pay. Now we're really seeing it. But add to that increased energy prices. We see energy prices going from really what was around a stable $40 a barrel to over 80 right now. That is driving up costs. And as John talked about, driving up input costs for farmers. Not just that, but natural gas. And natural gas is a key input now for electricity. That's going to drive home heating costs up. So beware. And anything that you can do today to say, whether it's opening up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, whether it is taking a look at housing vouchers, whether it's taking a look at doing the kinds of things that are going to reduce costs right where people live. But I will tell you, if I were messaging this, and over the weekend, a lot of Republicans talking about inflation and Build Back Better is horrible, what I would say is one of the key drivers is daycare. For working families, inflation in daycare has been deadly. That's why women are not getting back into the workforce. That's why we see grandparents taking care of their kids when they wanted to live out their golden years, maybe driving an RV around the country. Why don't they want to improve the affordability of daycare? Why don't they want to improve K through 12 education and pre-K education? Why do they not want to help families, working families, tackle these problems? And as John said, so much of what we see in these packages could actually help combat inflation. But as a message, they need to acknowledge it, which I think too late. They waited too long to do that. And then they need to set a benchmark and say, this is where we're going to drive things. And I agree, incidentally, with John Tester. I think if it hadn't been for Jerome Powell during the beginning days of the COVID, and if it hadn't been for the Fed, we would be right now in a depression. He reacted immediately when the administration and Trump refused to acknowledge it. I think Jerome Powell has done a great job running the Fed. I think it would be a mistake to replace him.
One last question before we get the hook here, but I do want to ask you, 2022, a lot of people prognosticating that it's going to be a very tough cycle for Democrats, that the House is basically lost. What's your sense of things? You go around the country talking to people, talking to folks in rural communities. Obviously, I feel like that's a backbone for kind of keeping the House majorities. What do you think is going to happen?
I think there's 3 wild cards. The first one is redistricting. And I know there's been a lot of reports, and everybody should pay attention to this. A lot of people think that as Republican legislators have dealt with redistricting, more districts have become leaning Republican, even though it doesn't reflect the majority of people in a state. So redistricting will play a role. I think that in the positive side, remember when we went into the 2020 cycle and everybody was predicting a 16 vote pickup or an 18 vote pickup for the House of Representatives? That didn't happen, and we lost races. So I think a lot of the races on the edge have already been gone. I think there's an opportunity with the right message to get some of those races, some of those districts back. I think it's all going to depend on how well we govern. But the most important thing is we need to know who the opposition is, Anna. You know, the opposition has been progressives versus moderates, and that's dominated the cycle now for 8 months. Guess who the opposition is? It's Republicans who don't want to help families with daycare. It's Republicans who don't care about climate. It's Republicans whose answer to every problem in America is to scare people and say no. And so if we focus on the lack of Republican agenda and the fact that this president, the former president, will get a toehold back into this economy and back into this democracy, and we can't let that happen, I think we've got a pretty good shot at turning this thing around. But we've got to do something now. We can't wait.
All right. Senator Heitkamp, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And again, a big thank you to the group One Country Project for making this conversation possible. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us on the virtual live stream this morning. We'll be back next month with more interviews like this one. So please stay tuned. Have a great day and stay safe.